In 2019, a nation of roughly 200,000 people, already scarred by a tsunami a decade earlier, watched a preventable childhood disease tear through its own children faster than almost anywhere else on Earth in modern history, killing 83 people in just over 3 months, the overwhelming majority of them under the age of 5. A decade before that, on a single morning in 2009, the entire country abruptly switched which side of the road its cars drove on, becoming one of the only nations in the world to make that change in modern times. This is Samoa, a place so far removed from the daily attention of the rest of the world that even its darkest, most consequential moments rarely make international headlines for long. And yet, underneath all of it, sits one of the most resilient, tightly structured societies anywhere in the Pacific. Picture a nation built almost entirely around a single, deeply ingrained social principle, one that has shaped how land is owned, how leaders are chosen, and how families organize their entire lives for well over 1,000 years. Picture that same nation surviving a colonial administration so negligent that it allowed a pandemic to kill roughly a fifth of the entire population within a single year. And picture a modern tragedy, just a few years ago, when a wave of public fear over vaccines collided with an outbreak of a disease long since eliminated almost everywhere else, killing dozens of children in a matter of weeks. How does a country carrying this much difficult history remain one of the most culturally intact, community-oriented societies left in the entire Pacific? Let's find out. Samoa sits in the central South Pacific, roughly halfway between Hawaii and New Zealand, an independent nation made up of 2 large islands, Upolu and Savaii, along with several smaller islands and islets scattered around them. The interior of both main islands dominated by rugged volcanic terrain rising toward Mount Silisili, Samoa's highest peak, cloaked in dense rainforest that gives way to a narrow band of coastal plain where the vast majority of the population actually lives. Often referred to as the cradle of Polynesia, Samoa holds a genuinely foundational place in the wider story of Pacific settlement, since archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests the islands were among the very first places settled by early Polynesian voyagers thousands of years ago, their distinctive lapita pottery and seafaring technology gradually evolving into the language, navigation techniques, and social customs that early Polynesian communities would later carry with them. But before those same seafaring communities eventually pushed outward across the vast Pacific to settle Hawaii, Tahiti, New Zealand, and eventually remote Easter Island itself, each of those distant island cultures still carrying linguistic and cultural threads that trace directly back to this same small cluster of islands. That deep historical role has left Samoa with a reputation, still widely respected across the wider Pacific world, as a kind of ancestral wellspring for Polynesian language, navigation, and social structure, a status many Samoans themselves take genuine pride in as a defining part of national identity. At the heart of Samoan society sits a concept known as Fa'a Samoa, literally the Samoan way, a comprehensive framework governing nearly every aspect of daily life that has remained remarkably intact, despite centuries of outside contact and colonial rule. Central to that system is the Matai, titled Chiefs, chosen not through inheritance alone, but through a genuinely meritocratic process within the extended family, or Aiga, that elevates individuals recognized for their wisdom, generosity, and capacity to lead, rather than automatically granting authority to the eldest son or closest bloodline, the way many other traditional chiefly systems around the world have historically operated. Samoan chiefly authority itself splits into 2 distinct complementary roles. Ali'i, high chiefs, who hold the primary social and ceremonial authority within a family or village, and Tulafal, orators or talking chiefs, entrusted with the right to speak formally on behalf of the Ali'i during ceremonies, negotiations, and council meetings, their relationship together forming one of the most distinctive and enduring features of Samoan social organization. Matai hold authority over family land, resolve disputes, represent their family in village councils known as Fono, and are expected in turn to ensure the well-being of every member of their extended family, mobilizing and redistributing resources, organizing ceremonial obligations, and maintaining social order, a 2-way relationship of authority and obligation that has kept Samoan land overwhelmingly under traditional, communal ownership, rather than falling into the kind of private, foreign-dominated landholding patterns that reshaped so many other Pacific territories during the colonial era. That resilience faced its most brutal test in the early 20th century, during the period when Samoa fell under successive waves of German and then New Zealand colonial administration. Germany had claimed formal control over Western Samoa in 1899, following decades of rivalry between German, British, and American interests competing for influence across the islands. And German administrators spent the following years attempting, with limited success, to reshape traditional Samoan governance to fit more directly under centralized colonial control, provoking early organized resistance from Matai, who resented that interference. In August 1914, shortly after the outbreak of the First World War, New Zealand troops occupied German Samoa without resistance, and just a few years later, catastrophe struck. In November 1918, a New Zealand steamship called the Talloon, carrying passengers infected with influenza, was allowed to dock in Apia despite clear warnings, and despite neighboring American Samoa having successfully imposed a strict quarantine that kept the same pandemic almost entirely out of its own territory, a contrast that would later stand as damning evidence of just how avoidable Samoa's tragedy actually was. The resulting outbreak tore through a population with no prior immunity to the virus, killing an estimated 20% of the entire Samoan population within a matter of months, one of the deadliest per capita influenza death tolls recorded anywhere in the world during that global pandemic. Entire families and villages wiped out within weeks, as the virus spread faster than any medical response could contain it. The New Zealand administration's negligence in allowing the outbreak to spread, compounded by a poorly organized public health response and an initial refusal to accept outside medical assistance, offered by American Samoa, permanently damaged Samoan trust in colonial governance and helped fuel a growing, increasingly organized independence movement. That movement, known as the Mau, meaning something close to opinion or testimony, gathered strength through the 1920s, organizing peaceful protests, boycotts, and civil disobedience campaigns demanding self-governance and an end to foreign interference in Samoan affairs, drawing support from Matai across the islands, who had grown increasingly frustrated watching colonial administrators repeatedly override traditional authority. In December 1929, New Zealand police opened fire on a peaceful Mau demonstration in Apia, killing 11 people, including a senior high chief who was reportedly shot while trying to calm the crowd, in an event that became known as Black Sunday, a tragedy that only strengthened Samoan resolve rather than suppressing it, turning a political movement into something closer to a unifying national cause. Decades of continued pressure, including a formal United Nations trusteeship established after the Second World War, specifically to guide Samoa toward eventual self-rule, eventually led to Samoa achieving full independence on the 1st of January 1962, becoming the first Pacific Island nation to gain independence in the 20th century, a milestone that carried enormous symbolic weight across the wider Pacific region, where colonial rule would persist in many neighboring territories for decades longer. The country was officially known as Western Samoa until 1997, when it formally dropped the word Western from its name entirely, a small but symbolically significant change that reclaimed a complete national identity no longer defined in relation to the neighboring American-administered territory to the east. Independence didn't mean abandoning the Fa'a Samoa system that had carried the country through colonization in the first place. Instead, Samoa's founding constitution deliberately blended Westminster-style parliamentary democracy with traditional Samoan governance, initially restricting the vote to Matai title holders before extending full universal suffrage to the wider population in 1990, a gradual transition designed to honor traditional authority structures while still building a functioning modern democracy around them. That same balancing act between deep tradition and modern governance continues to define Samoan political and social life today. Daily life across Samoa still visibly reflects that same enduring cultural framework. Villages remain organized around traditional oval-shaped houses called fail, open-sided structures with no walls at all, built to allow constant airflow through the tropical heat, and traditionally roofed with woven coconut palm thatch. Though modern versions increasingly use corrugated metal roofing while preserving the same open, wall-less design, woven mats roll down along the edges only when rain or wind genuinely demands it. Each village centers around a meeting house where Matai gather to conduct whānau, formal councils where community decisions are debated and made collectively, oratory itself treated as a genuine art form, with skilled orators, or tulafale, delivering elaborate, carefully structured speeches drawing on generations of accumulated genealogical and historical knowledge passed down orally rather than through written record. A spoken tradition considered every bit as sophisticated and demanding as formal written scholarship anywhere else in the world. Traditional tattooing, known as tatau, remains one of the most visually striking and culturally significant practices still actively performed in Samoa today, a tradition Christian missionaries attempted to suppress across much of Polynesia in the 19th century, but that Samoans never fully abandoned. The paa, an intricate, extensive tattoo covering a man's body from waist to knee, and the malu, a somewhat less extensive design traditionally applied to women's thighs, are still administered using traditional hand-tapping tools, carved from boar tusk, turtle shell, and wood rather than modern tattoo machines, a painful, hours-long process considered a genuine rite of passage, and a profound marker of commitment to Samoan identity and community responsibility, one that has seen a meaningful cultural revival in recent decades, even as tattooing declined or disappeared entirely across many other Pacific Island cultures. Samoan society has also long recognized fa'afafine, individuals assigned male at birth who embody a distinct, culturally accepted third gender role, occupying an established and generally respected place within traditional Samoan family and community life that predates Western contact entirely, often taking on important caregiving and household responsibilities within their extended families. Christianity, introduced by missionaries in the 1830s, has since become deeply woven into that same traditional social fabric, rather than replacing it, and Samoa today maintains one of the highest rates of church attendance and religious observance found anywhere in the world, village life still frequently organized around a strict evening curfew known as se, when households pause for family prayer, a tradition observed with genuine consistency across much of the country even now. That deep-rooted resilience has been tested repeatedly in the 21st century as well. On the 29th of September 2009, a powerful undersea earthquake near the Samoan Islands triggered a devastating tsunami, sending waves several meters high, crashing into coastal villages with almost no warning, killing well over 100 people across Samoa, American Samoa, and neighboring Tonga, and destroying entire coastal villages within minutes of the initial warning, communities along the southern coast of Upolu among the hardest hit. Families in some areas losing multiple generations at once as the water swept through homes built close to the shoreline their ancestors had lived beside for generations. Just over a week earlier, in a far less tragic but still genuinely unusual national moment, Samoa had switched which side of the road its vehicles drove on, shifting from driving on the right to driving on the left, specifically to align more closely with Australia and New Zealand, where the majority of Samoa's population living abroad, and the used cars many families relied on importing, were based, a change that required a coordinated national effort, weeks of public education, and a brief nationwide ban on alcohol sales to reduce accident risk during the transition, ultimately making Samoa one of the very few countries anywhere in the world to make such a fundamental shift in the modern era. Then, in 2019, Samoa faced arguably its most devastating public health crisis since the influenza pandemic a century earlier. Following a tragic incident in 2018 in which 2 infants died after nurses mistakenly administered an improperly prepared vaccine, mixing the vaccine powder with an expired muscle relaxant instead of sterile water, national vaccination rates collapsed, falling from around 74% to barely a third of the population within a single year, fueled further by anti-vaccine misinformation, spreading rapidly across social media, even after officials confirmed the deaths had resulted from human error in vaccine preparation rather than the vaccine itself, and even after the nurses responsible were convicted and sentenced. When measles reached the islands that October, it spread explosively through a population with almost no remaining immunity, ultimately infecting more than 5,700 people out of a national population of only around 200,000 and killing 83, the overwhelming majority of them young children under the age of 5, before an emergency mass vaccination campaign and a nationwide government shutdown redirecting thousands of public workers into the response finally brought the outbreak under control by the following January. Hospitals were overwhelmed for weeks, with more than 1,800 people ultimately requiring admission, and families across the islands still carry the physical and emotional scars of a crisis that public health experts around the world would later cite as a stark warning of exactly what can happen when a community's collective immunity breaks down this suddenly and this completely. Economically, modern Samoa relies on a combination that reflects both its deep agricultural traditions and its increasingly global diaspora. Small-scale farming continues to sustain many households. Taro and coconut remaining staple crops grown much as they have been for generations, alongside cacao, banana, and a variety of tropical produce sold in local markets or exported in modest quantities, and a growing tourism sector drawing visitors specifically to Samoa's relatively undeveloped beaches. And waterfalls and cultural experiences, positioned deliberately as a quieter, more culturally authentic alternative to more heavily commercialized Pacific destinations, with beach-vale accommodations, simple open-sided huts built directly on the sand, remaining a distinctly Samoan style of budget tourism found in relatively few other parts of the region. But perhaps the single largest driver of the modern Samoan economy comes from outside the country entirely. Remittances sent home by the substantial Samoan diaspora living and working in New Zealand, Australia, and the United States, a diaspora population that, by some estimates, now outnumbers the population still living within Samoa itself. Financial support that flows directly back into extended family networks and, through the same Whaia Samoa obligations that have defined Samoan society for centuries, continues circulating through village life in the form of church contributions, family ceremonies, and community projects, a financial lifeline that has helped sustain the traditional social system even as economic opportunity within Samoa's own borders remains genuinely limited. Despite the weight of everything Samoa has absorbed, a pandemic that killed a fifth of its population, decades of colonial rule, a devastating tsunami, and a measles outbreak that claimed dozens of its youngest citizens within recent memory, The country has continued to hold onto a social structure and cultural identity that has proven remarkably durable across more than 1,000 years. Matai still preside over whānau in village meeting houses, built the same open, wall-less way they always have been. Young men and women still choose to undergo the same painful, hours-long traditional tattooing their ancestors did centuries ago. And families still organize their lives, their land, and their obligations around the same core principle that has carried Samoan society through every crisis it has faced. That no individual truly stands alone, because the Aiga, the extended family, always stands behind them. In the end, what makes Samoa's story so remarkable isn't simply that the nation survived disaster after disaster, since survival alone doesn't explain how a society holds together across centuries of genuine upheaval. It's that Samoa gave the country something to hold on to through every single one of those crises, a framework resilient enough to absorb colonization, pandemic, natural disaster, and modern tragedy alike, without ever losing the fundamental shape of what makes Samoan society Samoan in the first place. If Samoa's deep cultural resilience through repeated crisis surprised you, subscribe, because there are more nations out there whose quiet, everyday strength rarely makes it into the headlines the rest of the world actually pays attention to.